Good morning, everybody. Well, good morning if you're in the sort of time zone like my time zone. For all I know, you're watching in the afternoon or even in the early evening. Welcome to this final session of the conference that has looked at 70 years of protection by UNHCR of persons of concern to the organisation. It has been a very rich conference. We've had contributions from the Asia Pacific region, from East Africa, from South Africa, from West Africa, from Middle East and North Africa, from Europe, from North America, and from South and Central America as well. Every time zone has been covered since we started on the 18th. And it has been a conference that has raised a range of themes, so many, but at the same time, they all come back to ideas that we see in the Global Compact on Refugees from 2018. When you look at Articles 4 and 5, now Article 4, for a lawyer, it's really hard because it says this document is not legally binding, but it goes on to talk about it representing the political will to better protect and assist refugees and host countries. Article 5 of that compact goes on to talk about how it seeks to operationalize better burden and responsibility sharing, again, so as better to protect and assist refugees. This is what we've been trying to talk about for the past 10 days, and we hope it's been entertaining and at the same time informative. We know that not only have we had these live streams, we've got the YouTube content, and that YouTube content will be made available for people to watch in the future. What I wanted to talk about in this particular part of the conference is really about how this conference has actually moved forward, how we should think about refugee research, refugee study. Because one of the most important things for me in the past 9 to 10 days has been how many persons who were actually displaced, who had experience of forced displacement themselves, who were on panels, who were speaking, because what the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network should be seeking to achieve is a truly global voice for those working in the field of refugee studies, including those who've been forcibly displaced themselves. This is so important, and I am so glad that we've managed to achieve it. So many young and emerging scholars have also been able to participate and to put their views across alongside people with expertise from years of experience in the field. One of the aims that I had when I became chair of the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network was that I would make certain that we stopped thinking about countries in the global south that host 85% of those persons of concern to UNHCR as merely being case studies for researchers from the global north. We have to move to a position where the voice of the refugee and other persons of concern to UNHCR are actually part of the planning for research projects, part of the study, part of the analysis process that goes on, and equally the partnerships are made between academics in the global north and academics in low and middle income countries that host all these persons of concern to UNHCR. And this conference has been one of the best advertisements for that approach. There have been so many okay, speakers from across the world who have been able to give their views. And I should point out here, one of the things that we did slightly before this conference was have a meeting with the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration on their code of ethics. And I think that's also been part of our discussions this week too, that there are ethical questions about carrying out research in this field. And I think we've addressed those ideas. I'm now going to hand over to Madeleine Garlick, who is Chief of Protection, Policy and Legal Advice at UNHCR. And she's going to talk about some of how we think about protection. But I should point out, if you go back, if you watched all those webinars, if you go back and watch them on YouTube now, what you'll see is just the breadth of issues, not just legal issues. We had geographers, we had social anthropologists all speaking, but they were speaking about how it's not just international refugee law. It's international human rights law. It's the international law of armed conflict. It's sustainable development goals, all of which are mentioned in Article 5 of the GCR. This is it might not be legally binding, but it is a document founded on legal standards that better protect. So, Madeleine, I've spoken there a lot about refugees and protection, but one of the things that we need to make certain is that academics have the potential to actually get their voice heard. Academics have to publish, it's part of the job. Okay, so while UNHCR is there and carrying out all this protection, how can it better work with academics? It's done it for decades. How can we actually make this possible in the future?
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you so much for highlighting the importance of engagement with academics and research. UNHCR has always engaged with and supported the work of academics, including, amongst other reasons, because of the crucial importance of anchoring protection policies in empirical knowledge, research and data about the situation of refugees worldwide and reflecting their perspectives and experience. Throughout its 70 years, UNHCR has needed to follow, draw from and contribute to new and innovative thinking on refugee law, but also, as you mentioned, so many other disciplines which impact on the lives of refugees. This has been essential to enable it to adapt to the fast-changing circumstances and environments in which we work, and to continue to provide effective and relevant guidance, responses, and support to states and our persons of concern. So this means supporting the development, dissemination, and discussion of the best independent scholarship that academia has to offer in relevant fields. HCR sought to do that, among other ways, through publishing cutting-edge research, and we've sought to do that in the Division of International Protection in our Legal and Protection Policy Research series. UNHCR also works closely with a number of academic journals, including the International Journal of Refugee Law and Refugee Survey Quarterly, amongst others. And staff also contribute to leading publications. And some of us have written chapters, for example, in the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of International Refugee Law. But as you said, the promotion and publication of high quality interdisciplinary work has also been extremely important. And this has received specific attention in recent years, including through the work of the UNHCR World Bank Joint Data Center, which is focused on a range of crucial practical issues, including access to livelihoods and economics, amongst other things. So this engagement has enabled HCR to develop UNHCR's policies, approaches, doctrine and guidance on protection to take account of developments, including in refugee law, but beyond that also in other relevant branches of law, including human rights, international humanitarian law, as well as regional refugee law developments and regional and national jurisprudence, state practice and soft law sources. In the first session of this conference, you spoke about XCOM conclusions, which also, of course, provide a crucial source of input from the member states taking part in the executive committee on key protection challenges and on possible ways forward to address these. This engagement with academic research, analysis, and ideas has also equipped us to work particularly well with our partners on some of the more challenging contemporary issues that we have seen over recent months and years, including in the area of mixed movements, looking at protection in the context of displacement linked to climate change and disasters, trafficking in human beings, and many others. Collaboration with scholars and researchers, including refugee scholars and researchers, has also helped us to bring new perspectives to bear on the long-standing principles, including those articulated in Article 5 of the Global Compact on Refugee, including responsibility sharing, including on non-refoulement, including on the need to ensure access to rights to refugees from all relevant bodies of law. These principles remain relevant even if the context and circumstances in which they need to be implemented have evolved. And that's why we need these research and insights to help us find new approaches to implementation that are going to work in today's circumstances. So this brings me to a question I'd like to put to you, Jeff. The GCR, of course, aims not only to recall those key principles grounded in international law, but also to provide a strong framework and impetus for their implementation in practice in today's context. How do the Compact's objectives, from your perspective as a key partner, help us move from principles to action?
If we look at Article 7, which sets out the objectives of the Global Compact, I think the first two of those objectives, which are to ease pressures on host countries and enhance refugee self-reliance, that's where we sort of start with all the research that we actually need to be undertaking at this time. Because, as I've said, 85% of persons of concern to UNHCR are hosted in lower middle income countries. So this idea of easing the pressures on host countries has got to be central to some of the research we're taking forward. Equally, we can achieve that by enhancing refugee self-reliance. Part of the problem in the past, distant past, one can only hope, is that refugees were quite often put in remote settlements, distant from local populations. They were supported by the United Nations, but to a large extent, and it's a term that I use, refugees were warehoused, okay, away from the state. The state, quite naturally, because if we're talking lower middle income countries, we're talking about countries that needed a lot of support in order to host what is now 85 million persons of concern, okay? But that was a very sort of short-sighted view of the potential that refugees could provide, okay? And equally, it didn't recognize the fact that most displacements are actually protracted. And while you can put refugees and other persons of concern to UNHCR into remote settlements, if you think it's only going to be 6 months that they're going to be detained, and detained is the right word there, because putting people in remote settlements is a form of detention, which should not be the norm ever, okay? If you're thinking somewhere up to 20 years, a remote settlement for refugees and other persons of concern is so wrong. It's just a waste of everybody's talent and equally a waste of opportunity. So one of the things that I've always advocated is that while protection might start with registration and documentation, that registration and documentation is a gateway to protection over time, and protection over time develops. So as refugees and other persons concerned to UNHCR, their displacement becomes longer. They need access to education. They need access to employment. The sooner the better. Okay. They need access to healthcare. Okay. And what is happening as well is we now have over 60% of persons of concern to UNHCR in urban settings. And what we mean by that is not in formal settlements. We mean about people living amongst the local community. So when you look back to the GCR and it talks about better protection of refugees, better protection and assistance to refugees, it adds in and host communities. Because if refugees and other persons concerned to UNHCR are living amongst host communities, then enabling them to access work, to access education, will actually improve the lives of everybody in that area, including the host communities. Refugees don't just turn up without any talents whatsoever. They come with experience. They come with knowledge. There is during COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen so many refugees who had medical training, health training, who've been able to work in order to not only protect those who are displaced alongside them, but also local communities. The number of stories we've seen of health and hygiene projects being started by refugees and other persons concerned to UNHCR during COVID-19 has been phenomenal. And this is what a proper approach to protection and assistance actually means. It's one that includes refugees and other persons concerned to UNHCR in the development plans of governments. It means that UNHCR works with the international community as a whole, which includes development actors, and that during protracted displacement, if only we didn't have protracted displacement, if only displacement was short to deal with immediate crises, but it isn't. Given that we have this scenario of protracted displacement, we need to make certain that refugees are incorporated into the national policies. There's an inclusive approach to refugees, and therefore that everybody benefits. But it does require the international community as a whole. We cannot let low and middle income countries bear all this burden without proper sharing from countries in the global north. And so I suppose my next question to you would be, refugee self-reliance has to be facilitated by the country of asylum with the support of the international community as a whole. I suppose, how has COVID-19 affected reception of refugees?
Yes, thank you, Jeff. Well, COVID-19, of course, has had an overwhelming impact on all of our lives, reminding us all that we are vulnerable, regardless of our origins, social or legal status. However, tragically, it has hit many asylum seekers, refugees, internally displaced people, and stateless persons in particularly devastating ways. Amongst the COVID-19 related measures that states have taken to tackle the public health crisis have been limits on entry at borders, and in some cases, access to asylum procedures. HCR has acknowledged that states have a sovereign right and a responsibility to take steps to protect their populations. And this includes against threats linked to health. But this can be done in a way which respects fundamental rights, including the right to seek and enjoy asylum, and non-derogable principles such as non-refoulement. It also can and needs to be done in a way which ensures that persons of concern to UNHCR can also enjoy their basic rights, including to sustenance, which includes a focus on ensuring access to means of self-reliance, as you said. People shouldn't have to wait for their rights. It's incumbent upon all of us involved in this area to help, to work, to advocate for, ensuring that these rights are realised, even while recognising the importance of proportionate, reasonable and time-limited measures to protect public health. And what UNHCR's monitoring has shown is that this is possible, and many states have done that, and their efforts are to be commended. And we encourage other states, of course, to look closely at the ways in which this can be done. This requires a lot of support to some states to ensure they have access to the technology and the means to do this, but it's something that can and must be done in the interests, as you say, of host communities as well as of displaced people themselves. HCR has been collecting and publishing data over the past 10 months on some of the impacts of COVID-19 upon protection on our platform, on temporary measures and impacts on protection, which is available on the web. These include, in the area of access to territory, for example, information that shows us that 140 states out of the 190 that we've observed have fully or partially closed their borders at some point. But very positively, 80 of those states are making exceptions for people who are seeking asylum. This demonstrates effectively that it's possible to take measures such as quarantine, testing, and isolation without denying access to territory and to asylum procedures comprehensively, and enabling such people to claim and have their claims assessed for international protection, even whilst the state is managing the public health crisis. In the asylum and statelessness determination procedures, we also see many states that suspended these at some point during the early stages of the pandemic, but now we know that at least 61 states are operating fully their asylum procedures, while some 50 are doing so on a partial basis. But what's very interesting is that we see that there's 111 states that have taken measures to ensure that they are using technology, remote arrangements, and creative ways to ensure that procedures and documentation can continue to be made available. We've seen many states who've taken steps to ensure that residence permits can be issued or renewed remotely rather than in person, as was the case in the past. And this has meant that people vitally have continued to be protected from the risk of expulsion and have been able to enjoy a legal status, which has, as you've mentioned, enabled many of them to take part actively in the public health response and to contribute to help address the needs of their host communities during this time. Documentation in this regard has been critical, as you've said, and this, of course, is crucially important for stateless people as well as for asylum seekers and refugees. So we've seen in many cases a positive measure in the sense that we have had states who have sought proactively to adapt their asylum systems to the constraints that COVID-19 has brought, using technology, systems for electronic registration of claims, interviews by video, and many others. We need to continue to support this and reach out also the countries who may not have the resources or the technical means to do this. And it's been great to see that some states have been ready to share their experience, to provide support on a kind of twinning or peer basis. And this needs to continue across the world. We need to ensure that asylum applicants who have been sitting for months waiting for their asylum claims to be dealt with are going to be able to see those progress even in the pandemic as it continues. We can't afford to have backlogs mounting up further during this time, with the risk that people who have enormous potential and who have the right to protection and need to get on with their lives are left waiting because the bureaucracy is unable to deal with their needs. Another important area where we've seen COVID-19's impact has been in that of detention. Places of detention can be areas where there are particularly threatening risks of infection, where there's difficulties in enabling proper social distancing and access to hygiene measures. So we welcome some of the moves that have been taken by some states to look at situations in which people can be released from detention, where they don't pose a security risk and there's no reason why they need to be kept in closed facilities. We've seen some states who have begun to roll out or to expand programs for alternatives to detention, whether this involves reporting requirements or some kind of semi-open facilities, in ways that have ensured that people who are in asylum processes are not exposed to risk and can nonetheless live in the community and can begin the process of seeking to have their asylum claim mount in ways where they are interacting with and contributing to their communities. We have recalled in the context of discussions around this, UNHCR's clear position that detention is never in the best interest of the child, and that we need to find alternatives informed by an ethic of care and not of deterrence for children who are in the asylum process. And this is particularly important in the way in dealing with the very significant impacts that COVID-19 has also particularly had on many refugee children in circumstances where they have had their education interrupted and their normal life and development affected by the COVID with all of its devastating effects. Speaking of children, it reminds us of the importance of an age, gender, and diversity sensitive approach that needs to inform all of UNHCR's activities. And that is also enshrined in the Global Compact in important ways. And I think the COVID-19 crisis has underlined to us the importance of ensuring that we are communicating with people who are in all of these groups effectively, enabling them to convey to us their perspectives, because quite often they are the ones who have the insights about ways to address their own challenges and situations that can really inform UNHCR and states in helping them to find solutions to the problems. Perhaps as our discussion continues, Jeff, it might be useful to zoom out a bit also to the wider picture. In the longer term, of course, we realise, as you have said, that we face enormous challenges due to protracted displacement, devastating waste of potential and loss of opportunities for people of concern to contribute to the communities which give them shelter. So we've seen really the challenge of protecting the displaced grow exponentially, both in scale and duration over the last decades. Our statistics report now that some 75% of the world's refugees are in protracted situations. So noting the challenges in finding solutions and ending this displacement, what can we do further to try and prevent displacement from occurring in the first place? And what can we do better in order to enable as many refugees as possible to fulfill their ambition to return home in safety and dignity when conditions permit one day?
Thank you, Madeleine. It's an issue, prevention, that the High Commissioner has been looking at for decades. Okay, so this isn't a new idea. It is part of the Global Compact, as you would imagine. But we've been talking about prevention for many decades. I mean, I was doing research on it in the 1990s, okay, and I was nowhere near at the beginning of that study. In fact, they probably started before I was born. What we need to remember is that with every displacement situation, there were causes. Sometimes you can't predict, and it would be interesting to look at how environmental factors, climate factors, are impacting displacement as well, because in some ways those are totally unpredictable. However, most displacement is caused by conflict. Okay, and conflict means that there are opportunities to prevent that conflict. There are opportunities to make certain that the conflict does not affect those not taking part in the conflict itself. As many people have said, there will be much less displacement during an armed conflict if the parties to the conflict actually abided by the rules of international humanitarian law, which is why, to my mind, protection of refugees includes not just international refugee law, international human rights law, you've got to include the international law of armed conflict as well. But when we're looking at prevention and solutions, because protracted displacement, if we can prevent it, fantastic. If we can't prevent it, we need to be looking for solutions. And if we take a look at Article 8 and Article 9 of that Global Compact, okay, they talk about prevention. They talk about the all states having to, in some way, try and prevent displacement and foster peace, security, and sustainable development. And I do want to talk about something that we did touch upon in some of the sessions, that when we talk about all states, that actually includes the states that sit on the Security Council. Okay, we talk about the Global Compact involving the international community as a whole, and that includes the United Nations as a whole. And the United Nations as a whole includes the Security Council. We must move to a situation where every single crisis that is causing displacement is a matter that the Security Council addresses, and in some ways, either directly or indirectly behind the scenes, wants to bring to an end. The UN as a whole has a responsibility. And so when we talk about states, we're not just talking about states sort of sending better facilities, but improving their resettlement. We're talking about states through international organizations achieving peace and security. And in that regard, okay, we need a holistic approach, okay, with 85 million persons of concern, okay, we need to make certain that states view this as something that is a priority to address for them in order that we can reduce the burden on those states, the lower middle income countries, okay, that are actually hosting most of the refugees. So if we can engage in prevention, fantastic. But that means that we need to think about how to prevent, how to make certain that conflict does not cause displacement, okay? It also means, because we are seeing ever increasing examples of this, where climate anomaly or some other form of natural event is actually affecting peace and stability within a country. If we have global warming, it's reducing the amount of water available, it's reducing the amount of land available for growing foodstuffs. This means that there are ever greater numbers of people where conflict is revolving around access to water, access to land for grazing, all these issues. And of course, as we know, climate anomalies have a much greater impact in lower middle income countries than they do in the global north. So yet again, those countries that are most affected by displacement, most affected by climate anomaly, the two of those factors are combining and are causing ever increasing movement. What we need to ensure is that we engage in prevention, okay, so that we take seriously global warming, okay, we take seriously the need that states as a whole, either directly or through international organizations, achieve prevention. The other aspect, okay, of durable and sustainable solutions, which we're speaking about in this afternoon session much more, is access to rights during displacement. Education is fundamental. We know that so many children who are forcibly displaced do not get access to schools. When UNHCR has asked me to carry out research on its behalf, I've done field trips. The one thing that is consistent, no matter where I've visited, is that the children always say, when you ask them what they want, it's education, okay? And UNHCR has facilitated that sometimes by allowing for distance learning, and sometimes by working with local actors, okay, either NGOs or other faith communities, to build schools in the region, so in this area where the people are now living, so that children can access. Primary school children, I think it's something like 50% of primary school children who are displaced get to go to school, okay? When it's secondary school, it's only about 25%. But what's staggering as a university academic is that only 3% of displaced persons manage to go into tertiary education. And one of the things that we've been talking about in some of the sessions that we've been holding over the past 10 days is trying to improve that figure. UNHCR has the Aiming Higher initiative currently taking place. It's 1530, so that by 2030, instead of it being a mere 3%, it's 15%. And scholarships for students to come and study in countries in the global north as part of that burden and responsibility sharing are a great initiative, but much more important, and something that COVID-19 has taught us is more possible than we ever thought, is distance education, but not sort of just something that people can log into whenever they can, and it's just an internet. We have been holding these Zoom webinars, and people have been able to watch in places where they're forcibly displaced. Why can't we do that with education? Why can't academics come together, work with academics in the countries that are hosting, the countries of asylum, so as to provide university level education sort of more readily for tertiary level refugees? It's got to be something that we learn from all this time on Zoom that we have been spending over the past year. And I suppose that's got to be where we sort of take this conference forward. What can we learn from our experience here that will actually, as part of the academic community, better protect and assist refugees and sort of make more fairer and more predictable burden and responsibility sharing with those countries that actually host 85% of persons of concern with UNHCR. I suppose to go back to the durable solution idea more specifically, the UN as a whole, including UNHCR, is part of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security agenda. One of the things that I've seen whenever I've been doing research with UNHCR in the field is just how much UNHCR involves women refugees in making decisions about how the protracted displacement will continue, but equally in finding solutions. Okay, so women not just involved in the life during displacement, but women as part of planning for the end of displacement. And UNHCR has always been doing that, and it's something it should be commended for. Okay, it's one of the great achievements of UNHCR as far as I'm concerned. I've gone from prevention through to solutions. But one of the questions I wanted to ask, and this is something that isn't necessary, it isn't part of the 51 Convention or to a certain extent the statute. Where does prevention fit in UNHCR's mandate? And I think that's something that really is important because UNHCR has a role in that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a crucial question that you've pointed to. And indeed, I think UNHCR's efforts to engage in prevention must be seen really as part of the wider responsibilities and activities of the UN system as a whole, as well, of course, crucially, as those of the states which make up the United Nations and its constituent bodies, including the Security Council, and who really have the means to help us tackle conflict and persecution and human rights violations most effectively if we can muster the will and the means to do so. In this commemorations event, it's interesting to look back at our history. And I note that in 1981, the then Secretary General appointed Prince Sadruddin Aga Khan, who was himself a former High Commissioner for Refugees, as a special rapporteur for human rights and mass exoduses, and asked him to look specifically at the question of addressing the root causes of flight. And his findings then really underlined very clearly the link between human rights violations and large-scale refugee outflows. The fact that we're still talking about this as a crucial and overarching problem, and that we have needed to adopt a global compact in order to try and address challenges around large movements, I think is testimony to the fact that this isn't something that we have succeeded in addressing, and where we really need to do better as an international community as a whole. In 2015, the annual High Commissioner's Dialogue that year also focused specifically on the issue of the root causes of forced displacement. And the background materials from that dialogue provide interesting insights to some of the starting points that UNHCR has built upon in its work since then. It emphasized the importance of seeking to catalyze action to address the drivers of displacement, and linked to that to finding solutions for those who are displaced. And that background paper acknowledged very clearly that it is much more effective to avoid the need for people to flee in the first place by addressing the causes of flight before they manifest themselves, rather than waiting to respond to the consequences with the resources, the sensitivities, and the enormous challenges that come around that. Prevention, of course, requires resources, authority, and mandates that go far beyond those of UNHCR alone, even though we have a crucial role in drawing attention to the need for this and seeking to engage where we can. But this is why it's so important, as we've said, to work so closely with our partners in the UN system and beyond. The Security Council has specific responsibilities in addressing conflict worldwide, of course, and we've heard the Secretary General call for renewed efforts to end conflict. His call for a global ceasefire last year as the pandemic took hold was a powerful one in that regard, but sadly one that wasn't sufficiently well heeded, and we continue to deal with some new as well as ongoing crises of conflicts worldwide that have continued and worsened in many cases, even as the pandemic has continued. One positive initiative I think we can point to in this regard is the Secretary General's initiative in the form of his call to action on human rights. He has underlined the importance of us looking more comprehensively at human rights throughout all of the work undertaken across the UN system, whether that work relates to development, to economic activities, to trade, because really the need to reinforce protection for human rights is fundamental to ensuring that people are going to have better means to avoid risks to their rights and persecution, and to minimize the prospects of needing to flee in the first place. Greater respect for human rights also gives us enhanced scope to ensure that voluntary repatriation can become a reality, bearing in mind that the majority of refugees in many situations tell UNHCR very clearly that notwithstanding their experiences, their trauma, notwithstanding ongoing conflict and sometimes the massive infrastructural and economic devastation that may wreak in their home country, this is really their dream. And it's incumbent on us as UNHCR, but also those who work with us and support us, to try and make that prospect of voluntary repatriation a reality. To return to the question of research that we addressed at the beginning of this then, Jeff, I think this is really linked to this, because we need to be informed by a better understanding of what kind of factors are important in creating the conditions to enable people to return. We need insights into specific national and regional dynamics, ways to overcome the effects of conflict, to rebuild economies, to rebuild societies, to rebuild the rule of law. And again, research into the situations and the many different aspects of post-conflict reconstruction is going to help us ensure that the right strategies are developed and can be supported and implemented with help from all those across the UN system and beyond. This means that we need to continue to invest in and to look to research on peace processes, including amongst that ways to include and ensure participation of refugees in those peace processes and repatriation efforts. Those perspectives are essential to make those efforts and processes effective and sustainable. Addressing challenges around things like housing, land, and property, noting that people need, if they're going to be able to go back and rebuild their countries, to have a secure place to live. In many cases, it's crucially important for them to be able to go back to the very places from which they came because of their strong roots to that, as well as the economic importance of having security of tenure and shelter in a place to live. We also need to look at research which can help us ensure we provide better support to those who are charged with improving service provision in countries of origin. We see in some cases refugees who aren't ready to go back to their countries of origin, much as they would like to, because they see that they have insufficient prospects of ensuring access to education for their children. You mentioned the vital importance of education for refugees, Jeff. We see that this is an absolute sine qua non for refugees to be able to return, because they are, of course, thinking of the future longer term and what their children and grandchildren are going to need when considering what their next steps need to be and looking for solutions. You talked also about climate change and disaster, Jeff, in looking at prevention efforts. And this is, I think, a really crucial and timely topic for us to be talking about when we look back at the last 70 years, but also at the challenges we're going to face in the years to come as UNHCR. UNHCR's High Commissioner, of course, has pointed to climate, the climate emergency, as he calls it, as being one of the major challenges that HCR is going to face in years to come. And his special advisor on climate action is working on developing a climate action strategy that includes as one of its pillars legal and normative aspects, which is a responsibility of the Division of International Protection, where we look at the relevance of refugee law in dealing with people who are forced to flee because of climate change and its adverse effects, as well as disasters. And in that area of work and in the legal considerations we have issued on this topic in October of last year, we emphasize that, of course, not all of those displaced in the context of climate change and disaster will be refugees, although there are some circumstances where climate and disaster interact with conflict, violence, persecution, and other factors, which mean that refugee law may be applicable as a basis for grant of international protection for those people. But what that climate action strategy that UNHCR is producing underlines is that the crucial priority has to be focusing on building resilience to the effects of climate change, enabling countries and communities to put in place measures to mitigate the effects of climate change, so that where possible we can avoid the need for people to be displaced from their homes and forced to move in the face of the effects of environmental degradation and climate factors. This, I think, is a crucial part of our prevention efforts in years to come to ensure that people won't be forced to move. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeleine. While we've been talking, there's been questions coming through, and one of them actually picks up on something you were just talking about, but it's about refugee flows prevention, but equally IDP flows, because a lot of the focus has been on refugees, not as much on IDP populations. And how can UNHCR and how can the academic community sort of bring this together? The Global Compact on Refugees is, as it says, a compact on refugees, but obviously it also includes host communities. And host communities quite often include IDPs. So how is UNHCR thinking about prevention in the context of IDPs?
Certainly. Last year, UNHCR issued its revised IDP policy, which have underlined the importance of us continuing to step up and to fulfill the mandate that we have for dealing with IDPs in certain situations where the three preconditions for our engagement are fulfilled, namely the agreement of the country of origin, presence on the ground, and an interagency agreement in place for the sharing of roles and responsibilities to respond more effectively. IDP protection, of course, involves many other actors besides UNHCR alone, and this has been underlined in the interagency framework and by the General Assembly. So we have crucial partnerships with a whole range of UN agencies, from UNICEF, UNDP, the International Organization of Migration, and many others who also participate in providing support and assistance to IDPs. We also, I think, and have seen in the context of the work of the Global Protection Cluster, which is the specific structure that's been set up to ensure effective coordination in internal displacement situations, enhanced efforts to ensure that responses can be timely, that they can be most effective, and that they can involve affected people themselves as well as their host communities. So we have UNHCR, which in many circumstances has lead responsibility for the Global Protection Cluster, as well as for camp coordination and camp management. But there are other actors who step in on other aspects around that, be that water and sanitation, be that shelter, and child protection needs, and addressing gender-based violence, and many others that arise in that regard. We've had increased focus also on the situation of IDPs in a number of discussions in recent years, linked to the high-level panel that has been initiated by the Secretary General, which is charged with specifically focusing on ways in which we can, as a United Nations, respond more effectively to IDP challenges. So I think there's a lot of work being done there that's going to help us to strengthen our responses to this ongoing challenge in years to come, bearing in mind that indeed the vast majority of people who are displaced worldwide are within the borders of their own countries and need precisely this kind of specific internal displacement support.
And I think that research on this area is, the problem is that we tend to work in silos in academia. Now, that's not just the legal and the social anthropologists being in different silos, but even as lawyers, and even as lawyers working on forced displacement, so much research that is carried out either focuses on refugees or it focuses on IDPs. And quite often we have mixed displaced populations. So there are so many countries, so many of those situations where the Global Protection Cluster is working alongside UNHCR, dealing with the same large population that is made up of both people who've been arrived across a border alongside people who have been displaced within that country. So many of the countries hosting refugees are also countries that are facing conflict themselves. You think of the Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance, which has both refugees from neighboring countries, it has internally displaced persons, and there are climate issues going on, access to clean water, all these issues that COVID-19 has obviously affected as well. I think academia needs to start looking at displacement and bringing together all the different laws. And this is where we come back to, what does protection mean? And protection isn't just human rights. Protection is the law of armed conflict. It's the Sustainable Development Goals. No one left behind. And that includes the forcibly displaced, whether they be internal or refugees coming from another country. It's this holistic approach, which has come out during this series of webinars, but which I think needs to be much more part of the research agenda going on in academia that then feeds into UNHCR's thinking and planning. And I suppose that's the question. You are the Chief of Protection, Planning and Legal Advice. No, Protection Policy and Legal Advice. I apologize. How much of your work, and I think this has got to be the last question, okay, how much of your work means that you're trying to make this more holistic response to all those who are persons of concern to UNHCR, and if there's any reference you can make to stateless persons in your response, that too should be part of sort of what the academic community takes away from this particular session.
Thank you, Jeff. I think you mentioned earlier in our discussion today the concept of protection and how this has developed and been understood in an increasingly expansive way over time. And I think that's really at the heart of what we're talking about here. UNHCR's mandate, clearly laid out by the UN General Assembly in the Statute of 1950 and elaborated upon in the 1951 Convention, has continued to evolve over time. And this is not because UNHCR thinks it's a good idea, but it's because states have called upon us to do new and different and important things. Stateless persons, we have a crucial role as the agency under the 1954 and 1961 statelessness conventions to seek to helps address the problems of stateless people, bearing in mind that these are a group of people who, in many legal senses, are the most vulnerable of all. We don't even know how many there are precisely in the world. Official figures say it's 3 million, but we estimate it could be well over 10. So UNHCR has been asked by the international community to take on more over the course of this time, these 70 years. But what is increasingly clear, I think, here is that these really are challenges that we cannot and shouldn't be seeking to take on alone. Partnerships are crucial in that regard. And this, I think, is what is really reflected in the Global Compact with its multi-stakeholder approach at the center of everything it's calling for there. And what I think we see really is that actors that have contributions to make, and this including crucially and centrally our persons of concern themselves, are responding to that. Over 1,400 pledges made at the Global Refugee Forum last year. A range of initiatives and activities that are going on this year also to respond to the pandemic that reflect this multi-stakeholder approach. So this, I think, has to be crucial to UNHCR's work as it goes ahead now into the next years. And it's the only way we're going to be able effectively to respond to the challenges. And that means that all of us as partners need to be looking at this together. Thank you.
That brings this particular webinar to a close. I'd like to thank Dr. Madeleine Garlick for her insight. And when you consider that she is the Chief of Protection, Policy and Legal Advice for the whole of UNHCR, for her to give us this time now, I'm so grateful for the insight that you provided. It's been so interesting to just talk about protection. We keep on coming back to the Global Compact on refugees, but all the time we're having to think about all the other aspects of protection that UNHCR carries out and the wider roles that have been given to it by states that now include issues of climate change that nobody would have thought back in 1950 when the statute was first being sort of drafted would be one of the major sort of ideas that UNHCR has to contend with. And let's face it, nobody was thinking of COVID-19 and how UNHCR has had to respond to that, how protection has had to be something that happens immediately and with very little experience to draw on of global pandemics. I would like to thank everybody involved, particularly the people at Essex, the tech team, to the interpreters, So grateful to them, to Claire Simmons, who's the research officer for the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network, who made so much of today happen and the whole of this series of webinars happen. If you are able, come and join us again at 4 p.m. Central European time. Sorry, I'm in the wrong time zone. I have to think about this. For the next and final webinar, which is about solutions. One of the things that has always been part of my research has been that while protection and solutions are separate parts of the refugee experience, it's not a dichotomy. Protection, if it's done properly, helps refugees have the ability to achieve their own solution and the solution they want. But we've talked a lot about protection this morning. This afternoon, we're going to focus on solutions. Thank you again to Madeleine and to everybody who's been watching at this moment. We say goodbye. Hope to see you at 4 p.m. Central European time. Goodbye for now.
Thanks to you, Jeff.